morning, everybody. It's nice to see such a full house. One thing I wanted to mention is we won't all be in this room all day like this, so we'll have some time to go into our breakout rooms and kind of have some space to spread out as well. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Annie Insana. I am the Senior Director of Educator Preparation. I work with a fantastic team with the Office of Educator Licensure and Preparation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce my colleagues who are spread across the room. I'll start with my manager, Michael Derline, our Executive Director of Educator Licensure and Preparation. I have to get our cheat sheet. We did some reshuffling in our office and got some title changes around, so I had to make sure I got everything right. So Michael's back there in the back. Martin Nash, our Director of Ed Prep and Accreditation. Shay Olmstead out in the registration area. She's our Director of Licensure and Operations. Susan Jones, right there, Director of our Networks and Partnerships. We're very happy to have Becky Cox join us as well. She's our Executive Director of Early Literacy. Did I get that right, Becky? Yes. And then I also want to introduce the newest face to our team. Lindsay Nelson has joined us since August. Will be here through at least December, hopefully longer. And she serves as our EPP Literacy Consultant and has done a lot of wonderful work in the short time she's already been here. So we really appreciate that you all are here. We have a very packed agenda for you all today, but I do want to recognize how difficult it is to leave right now on a Monday, with it being late October. The holidays are coming up. I'm sure that there's a lot going on at each one of your institutions, so we just really appreciate that you're able to take the time today, and we hope that this is going to be a valuable experience for you all. We have planned for you all to do some deep dives into some examples to prompt your thinking about the drafting that you may have already done or are just starting with these next round of proposals. And we really also want to provide for you some valuable work time with your colleagues as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about the agenda today and sort of what the rest of our time together will look like here shortly. I wanted to start first, though, for those of you that have been here this is our fourth EPP Literacy Network meeting. We started this network, we launched it in January of this year, and we have been fortunate enough to host, this is our fourth meeting, and we have plans to continue our literacy network next calendar year, which I'm very excited about because by that time, our proposal process will be coming to an end, and we can really focus on a lot of things that are so important in terms of the implementation of what you all are doing, that you're proposing in those documents, and the changes that you're making to your programs. And so we're really excited about today to do those deep dives, but also next calendar year as we really look at what's actually happening now that these proposals are underway. So as a reminder, we have our mission statement up here. The EPP Literacy Network is dedicated to excellence in literacy instruction for children and adolescents in Tennessee schools, and recognizes the importance of teacher education and promotes the preparation of effective literacy educators in Tennessee. And so our main purpose here is that the Literacy Network, we work very, very hard to ensure that we have representation from every EPP across the state. We've been pretty consistent with that. We've had anywhere between 85 to 95% participation across our meetings. It's such a lovely time to get together with state colleagues that you don't always get to see. So we're just really quite excited about being able to put y'all together and do this essential work. The network so far has been very focused, as you all know, on proposal process. That's a big part of this. It is sort of that accountability piece, but again, we see the vision for this network going above and beyond that work as well. We show this slide during each meeting, and we talk about, even though each of these bullets here may be touched upon throughout your work today, our primary focus is to really focus on these 3 bullets listed here in red. First, to think critically and examine and revise program design, thinking about these new EPP literacy standards. Secondly, to develop and implement coursework across the state to be support teachers' professional learning in alignment with the Read to Be Ready initiative. And also to be sharing. You all are doing a lot of really great work already, proposals aside, that it's just so important to get everyone together to think about what are these quality resources, what can we do to share what's being done in terms of instructional practices, assessments with your candidates. We're going to focus on these 3 here too. Like I said just before, I think these other bullets may come up in conversations today. I can think of one, that first bullet here, continue to develop understandings of teaching literacy in Tennessee. Now, you may remember when we started the proposal process for early elementary and special education, we had the benefit of having the Teaching Literacy in Tennessee document, and we're so fortunate that we had that document. Now, one thing that I want to say off the bat is even though that work for teaching literacy in Tennessee for grades 4 through 12 is currently in development, what we've maintained is our tight collaboration across the department to work with Becky's team, to work with our standards folks, to really gain a sense of what are these underlying principles that may surface in the Teaching Literacy in Tennessee document that are going to carry through from early literacy to these upper grades. And we're very fortunate to have Becky here, and I know as we get into particularly the ELA example today, there may be times where she'll highlight some of those similarities and underlying principles to be mindful of. So please know that we've been very intentional about the design of this proposals with our colleagues at the department to ensure alignment, that even though this other document's not yet published, we're still being very thoughtful about what are those principles that need to be considered, and a lot of it was already articulated in our EPP literacy standards. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody was familiar with that. We continue that cross-collaboration. We find that very essential to this process. I also noticed the second bullet here to identify and negotiate tensions related to effective literacy preparation. This is very essential, and this comes out a lot in our conversations. This work is not easy. There's a lot that we're asking for and that we are asking you to think about in terms of what you're offering in your programs and how you can stretch and just really consider what do our candidates need to be the most effective teachers of literacy, and oftentimes those challenges surface. And this is a place to consider those challenges. But we also challenge you all to think about those challenges as opportunities and to think about how we can recognize that there is maybe a tension there, but to think about what we all can do and how you can leverage the collaboration and network that you have here to be able to come to what's going to be best in terms of what your candidates need and ultimately what our students need. And then finally, fostering connections between teacher educators and programs and pre-K-12 partners. We see a lot of overlap between what's happening now with EPPs and our primary partnerships and our agreements. And I know that a lot of those are kind of getting underway, and you're focusing on really important things like what is collaboration, what does it look like, and those fundamentals are really taking shape. But we also see that there's an opportunity with your LEA partners to talk about this work in literacy and to talk about what are quality, high quality instruction materials, and think about what's going to be best to support that preparation in EPP with the knowledge that you all have about your LEA partners. And so that may kind of come in and out of conversation today, but it's not a primary focus. Again, we're kind of looking at these three purposes in which we've outlined in red. So just to kind of reiterate today, what the department has done is at the end of September and the beginning of October, many of you are already familiar, but we hosted 3 webinars Each of these 3 webinars were focused on each of the 3 proposal groups. So the first one was for our ELA middle and secondary. The second one was targeted for our instructional leader programs. And then our third webinar was focused on our non-ELA middle, secondary, CTE, and pre-K-12 programs. In the work that we sent out for you just about a week ago in preparation of this meeting, we asked for you all to review those webinars because we think that they contain really important information to not only understand the logistics of the proposal requirements, but to also kind of start getting a glimpse into what that rubric criteria is, to just sort of have this high level of understanding. Because what we really want to focus on today is some deep dives into examples and thinking about those examples in relation to the rubric criteria that should help prompt your thinking about your own programs and proposal development. So that's really our aim here for our first objective, to continue to deepen those understandings of the proposal requirements through the use of evaluative rubrics and example responses. Secondly, we want you to use this time that you have. We're going to build in work time for you all to be meeting with your EPP partners, to be meeting with people across the state, to determine your next steps, and to even do some drafting today, to continue moving all of these proposal documents forward. And then finally, we talk a lot about this, but we wanted to put this first or foremost on an objective slide to say that it's really important that you are utilizing this network to make connections with EPP faculty across the state. And these connections may occur outside of literacy network meetings. And so we're really encouraging you all to talk with one another, to build these relationships with other ed prep folks, so that you might even reach out in between these meetings for support, not only with these proposals, but just to understand what are other programs doing that may be great to build off of or generate additional ideas. We all know there's great power in collaboration, so we really hoping that you all can think carefully about how you're using this time to network. Just to be brief, we want to talk about our network norms. We really have built this time to be intentionally supportive of you and where you are with this proposal drafting process. So we ask for you to be actively engaged. We ask for you to contribute to an environment that's safe and conducive to sharing. We know that this is all fairly new. We're all kind of in this similar space, so we just ask for you to honor this environment as that safe sharing space. To seek to understand through active listening and thoughtful questioning, to offer and be open to constructive criticism. Please monitor your airtime, whether you're in a breakout session or back with a whole group, just to make sure that we're giving everybody a chance to be thoughtful and to contribute. And again, to keep students at the center of your discussions. And again, when we think about students, the students in this regard are obviously K-12 students, but they may also, we want to be thoughtful about our candidates as well. So we use that term kind of broadly. I think our department staff is going to be really thoughtful about these network norms too. So we're going to be mindful about our active listening and thoughtful questioning and that type of constructive criticism. We're open again. We use this network very carefully. We really honor the feedback that you provide and use it to structure future meetings. We're going to ask the same of you towards the end of the meeting today to provide that feedback and to think about what else we can do to help support these efforts and what other resources we might consider to support this good work. Are there any questions about the objectives today or the norms before we get into our agenda? Okay, great. Let me talk briefly about your agenda. You have a lovely set of resources in front of you. Your agenda is actually located in your red folder on the left side. Should be that very first document. It outlines the agenda for you all today. We're going to dive right into our very first example response. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with this structure, again, what our purpose is today is to really do that deep dive of example of thinking about a particular example, and I want to note here that these are not exemplars. These are examples to think about that may be missing information, but might also provide some ideas for you all as you're thinking about drafting your own responses in this regard. So what we're going to do is at 10:20, we're going to lead a session in here that's going to focus on the ELA middle and secondary proposal, okay? And what we're going to do is, and we'll get into the logistics of this example here shortly, but basically we're going to give you time to review an example. We're going to give you time to talk with your tables about what you see, what you don't see, what can make this example stronger. And then we're going to generate a whole group discussion about that example. And we're going to do that from 10:20 to 12 o'clock today. So really focus heavily on that ELA first. We'll take a break for lunch. This will be a non-working lunch. It'll be 45 minutes. We invite you to go and eat, to talk, use this time to network with your colleagues and with others. And then at 12:45, for those of you that offer instructional leader programs, we invite you to come back into this main room and walk through an instructional leader example that we've provided, and to kind of negotiate and follow that same sort of thought process. If you don't offer an instructional leader program, I'm going to get to that and where you can go and what you can do during that time shortly. Instructional leader example will go from 12:45 to 1:45. We'll take a short break at that time, and then back in this room again, we will do a non-ELA CTE pre-K-12 example. So we'll do kind of a deep dive in that regard for a little bit over an hour. After that time is over, we'll kind of do a quick whip around to do just some big patterns of thought, big aha moments in a whole group sharing session. And then we'll kind of round out our day. We'll all be exhausted, I'm sure, by that time, and talk a bit about how you submit these proposals and some next steps to consider as you engage in this work. So let me talk about your work time today. So we want you to be thoughtful about what your needs are and how you want to best use this time to get what you need out of this network meeting. So we have 3 breakout rooms available today. And during these times that we've listed here, from that 10:20 time, that 12:45, and that 2 o'clock time, I'll just use an easy example. If you don't offer an instructional leader program and it doesn't make a lot of sense for you to be in this room navigating that example, then we invite you to go to one of these 3 breakout rooms where you can go and sit with your colleagues and to draft responses, or to network with other folks across the state, as well as to engage with any of our TDOE staff who will be floating around to answer those kinds of questions and help you think through that, okay? So for those of you, so I want you to kind of think through what's going to be the best use of your time today. And as you look at this, I'm going to give you all just a couple minutes to talk with one another, but we want you to kind of plan out your day, okay? It can take many forms. You can have just the ELA if you're here with 2 other colleagues, and you want to sit in the ELA section while your 2 colleagues go out to a breakout session and work. That makes a lot of sense. If you all want to stay together and sit through maybe just the first example and then use the instructional leader time to go and collaborate and work on your own, that makes sense too. So basically this work time is up to you to decide how you want to use it. Are there any questions about that before we give you a chance to talk with each other about how you want to plan your day? Okay, why don't we spend just about 3 or 4 minutes, talk with your colleagues here, and think about how you want to break up your day today. Just to reiterate, we will have TDOE staff kind of floating in between rooms wherever you want to select into one of these breakout rooms. The Arabian and Clydesdale, each room is set up for about 30 people. So the Arabian and Clydesdale rooms are just right over here next to these 2 rooms. So those are right next door. The Appaloosa room is actually over here to the left, and then back, if you turn left at the end of the hallway there, it's kind of in that back corner. So you're free to go to any room that you'd like during these sessions that, that you have chosen, okay? So what we imagine is that we'll have probably the majority of folks in the room for this ELA middle secondary example, and that's great. At this time, if there's anybody who does want to go into one of the breakout rooms to work with their teams, you can go ahead and make that transition now. In the meantime, if anybody is choosing to do that, I wanted to orient you to the materials in front of you. So again, in your red folder, we're going to pull out several documents here. In addition, if you're more of an electronic person, we've got flash drives that you can borrow and download any of the resources that you see in front of you onto your computer and navigate them from there if you so choose. Or you can download them and share them with your colleagues who weren't able to attend today. Okay? So just as a reminder, if you are heading out to go work on your own, these are the 3 rooms. I would probably jot these rooms down too in case you're leaving after this one, and that way you remember where those breakout rooms are. So in your red folder, one of the first documents we'd like for you to pull out is an example document right behind your agenda. And it's it actually says evidence examples for early elementary and special education proposals. So if you get that document in front of you, I want to talk briefly about that before we jump into the example. Let me talk briefly, just as a reminder, for deadlines for this ELA middle and secondary proposal. All proposals are due January 28th for ELA middle and secondary, and also for instructional leaders. We'll cover that again when we hit instructional leaders. And all EPPs will receive notification whether their proposal either meets expectation or has a need for revision. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with this process, this is an iterative review, meaning that when you submit the proposal on January 28th, we will have a series of trained reviewers. Each proposal will be read multiple times by different reviewers, and they will lay out the evidence that they see that matches the rubric criteria and then provide feedback for each one of the comprehensive question areas. And if the proposal comes back needing revisions, then you'll be given another opportunity to look at that reviewer feedback, make those revisions, and then resubmit in April. And we'll get an actual due date in April as that process begins to unfold. Okay. Should you resubmit in April and then the reviewers read it again and then determine that there are additional revisions that need to be made, EPPs will be given a third opportunity to submit that proposal in June of 2019. Okay? What our expectations are is that these EPP standards will be implemented in your programs in fall of 2019. This is also an important area to say, where's Austin P? I'm just talking with y'all, there you are. So Benita, you were just talking about how nice it was that you gave one of your instructors a course release to be able to work on. Angela, you got a course release to be able to work on all this. That's such a wonderful, wonderful thing that leadership can do. I don't want to rub it in, but to say this is a very thoughtful approach to consider what heavy lift this is, right? I mean, that's the truth of the matter. The other thing that we need to consider is that nobody predicts that they need to do revisions, but should revisions be required, you notice that they're during the summer months primarily, so you want to be thinking about what capacity will be needed in order to make those revisions. And we point this out now so that you can start some of that forward thinking about what you'll need to be able to make those changes. Okay, so let's transition briefly, and you've got that document in front of you. This is just something really brief, but we learned so much from the early elementary special education process And there's a couple things that I think we wanted to articulate now that we think is going to be helpful as you're drafting your responses even as soon as today. Okay? So there's a term that we use that's evidence. So evidence is rationale or additional detail or course assignments, anything that helps support the EPP's response to a particular question. We use that term evidence broadly. It's kind of like an umbrella term, okay? And what you'll notice from this proposal process is that you are required to submit narrative responses to the comprehensive questions, and then you have either required or optional attachments. And I wanted to make a couple points here. We train reviewers to look primarily at the narrative responses. That means that when you're drafting these, you want the weight of the argument or the rationale to be carried in the narrative response. Should you be required to submit attachments? For the ELA example, question 3 requires attachments. That's because they're candidate assessments. We actually want to see what the candidate assessment is. Those attachments, they're open-ended. You can submit what you think makes sense to include to support the narrative response and to provide additional evidence. Okay? So that could be a course syllabus, that could be a course description, for example. But an attachment is there to support what's already written in the narrative response. Kim, can you talk loud?
I thought you said on the webinar that today we would get limit sizes on attachments. Did I make that up?
You did. You do have those, and those are in your submission guidelines, and we'll talk about those later today.
Okay, thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks for bringing that up. So yes, we want to limit the amount of attachments. That means we can't, be including 90-page syllabus or multiple, courses. It's probably lovely work, but our reviewers get fatigued when they're reviewing it. So we want to try and pinpoint the most important, the most crucial evidence that's there to support the argument for and the rationale for those narrative responses. So if you look at this document here, so I wanted to make that sort of clarity piece there. Talk about evidence, it includes narrative responses and attachments. Narrative responses should carry the weight. Now, the most common reason why proposals require revisions is because there was a lack of specificity in the narrative response and the attachments they submitted. In other words, what we often saw, and there's reviewers in this room, they could always chime in too, what we often saw was sometimes just a repeat of the rubric language within a narrative response, and then the reviewers were left, I just don't know if I have a sense of confidence that this proposal is actually meeting the expectations, okay? And so we provided a couple examples for you to look at here on this page. It's a horizontal page. You'll all be familiar, the rubric should be familiar to many of you, right? This is for early elementary and special education. So this is the process that already happened. But we included examples of what we would consider weak evidence and strong evidence, okay? And what you can see on that first page for 3A, for question 3A, the question was that the submitted assessments and narrative responses requires candidates to engage in deep literacy content knowledge with appropriately complex texts. And what you can see down here is in that very first example that we are considering weaker than the other, is that we see, especially in that second sentence, the creation of this unit requires candidates to apply a fundamental knowledge of how skills-based and knowledge-based competencies work together. That's clearly addressing the criteria. But if you look at how the strong piece of evidence addresses the knowledge-based and skills-based competencies, what you can see here is that, in fact, if you look at the second to last sentence in there, how the research shows that children need to see how constrained skills are carried out in meaningful ways. This tells reviewers that this EPP has that sense that constrained skills are those skills-based competencies, right? And they're, in addition, this is not required, but in this particular case, they're using the research to support the evidence that they're providing to answer this question. So we just challenge you as you're thinking about this, how are we going to be creating these meaningful responses that really get at the heart of what the question is asking? We've said repeatedly that this proposal process is not compliance-based. It's very different than the processes that we've had in the past. And we need to have the sense of confidence that this rubric criteria is being met and it's being thoughtfully integrated throughout the literacy preparation for this particular proposal. Okay, does that kind of help? I just wanted to point that out now because, again, it was the most common issue for proposals that required revisions. Are there any questions or comments about that? Or any reviewers in the room that want to elaborate on that? There's another example if you flip the document over. This was for question 4, which was all about student difference. You can see again that the responses do use the rubric language, and we encourage you to use the rubric language. But we want to think about ways in which the responses are very clearly integrating these expectations throughout the program. Again, this one happened to have a research connection. It's not required. It was just a way that this EPP was able to articulate that particular connection. We also think this might be a helpful tool as you're drafting today and you're looking at the rubric criteria and you're really thinking deeply about it. And again, just in the spirit of moving beyond compliance, but thinking about what do we already do well that's being addressed that we can elaborate on in these narrative responses, and what areas do we have the opportunity to build out and be more thoughtful. So again, just a resource, but just wanted to kind of share with you what we learned from that first process and to support what we're asking for with this next round. Any questions about that? Okay. Well, we're going to transition and actually get into an example response today. And before I turn it over to Lindsay, the documents that you need in front of you today, if you look on the right side of your folder, the very first packet that you'll see is the example response for an ELA middle and secondary proposal. And we want to stress again that what we're providing for you today is an example. It is not an exemplar. We are not saying that everybody should do this thing in their programs in the same way. We are simply providing an example for you all to think through and to be thoughtful about using the rubrics as you're drafting and really get at the heart of what those questions are asking. So today, and Lindsay will walk you through this, but we'll give you a chance to read through this document, and Lindsay will also talk to you about what are all the parts of this document in which you have in front of you. And you'll be given the chance to review it independently, to talk with your table mates about what you see and what you don't see, and collaboratively as a whole group, we will have a whole group discussion about what could be done to make this response stronger, and in what areas is this response already very strong. Okay. So Lindsay, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so as Annie said, this is the time where we actually look at an example response. We heard very positive feedback from you all from the last time around with early elementary instead. This was a very productive use of time. And so specifically thinking of the ELA middle and secondary proposal, like Annie said, this is the packet you already have in front of you. Just to reemphasize, this is an example and not an exemplar. there are parts in here that are not fully developed. There are sections that attempt to approach the rubric criteria, but that need more. And that's the exact things that we want you to pay attention to note, to dissect, to pull up on. We are limited in time, obviously, and so before we get into this, know that you might not completely finish reading and reviewing this entire response. That's okay. We want to at least begin that work today and have those rich collaborative discussions. And this might be something that you take back to your EPP and continue from here. So the first thing I'm going to do is orient you around the materials within this packet. The first, if you have completed a proposal template for early elementary or SPED, this looks really familiar. We actually took a Word document version and copied it in. So I know all of the logistical challenges that occur when we do that. I know some of you are smiling and nodding your head. And so you can see what it actually looks like. Even though the font is small, we think there's benefit in seeing the question actually inserted into the template. The pages to follow include attachment samples. Within the response, attachments are referred to. We have specified the naming convention. So instead of Q3 EV1 as it was before, you'll see AT, because we really want to reemphasize that word and that term attachment. And also to Annie's point, there are a few pieces of attachment that do not include an entire 20-page document. And even when we were going through this process, we thought, okay, instead of this 20-page, what is the one page that we need, or what is the specific part I'm referencing within the response? So hopefully you'll see a good sampling of that, and probably some very familiar documents as well that you use or continue to use this time around. And then after the attachments, the very last page, you have one piece of the rubric. So since we are just looking at a sample response from question 3A for ELA middle and secondary, we pulled that part out. So it might look funny because it's kind of freestanding. If I were you, I would pull it and actually have it to reference separate from this packet. It was only there to keep everything together so we wouldn't confuse. If you want to see the full rubric one, if you have that with you, great. Also, those USBs have the full rubrics by folder and by proposal if you want to see that as well. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Lindsay. Are the comprehensive questions on this first page, are they electronic? I'm not finding them.
Yes, they are. So they should be on the USB. If you're looking in the ELA folder, it'll say proposal template. And if you scroll down, it'll look like a blank version of this template, and it'll have each comprehensive question one by one by one. If you're not seeing it, in a second we move into independent work, grab me, and I'll be glad to make sure you get it. Yeah, of course. Okay? So in just a moment, when we give the independent work time, the point here is for you to put on the hat of a reviewer. And today we're less concerned with coming up with an exact score of meets or approaching, and we're more concerned with finding those areas of this response that are strong and fully aligned to the rubric criteria, and then also those areas that maybe technically meet the rubric criteria, but you still have questions about, and it's not fully developed, it still needs more, and maybe even jotting down for your first read, what would those suggestions be, or what are those questions, right? What's the feedback you would give candidates if you were receiving this within your coursework? So really highlighting and annotating for those specific two areas, what is present, what needs more, and if there is a section, if you're looking at the rubric criteria that you think, I don't see this, I actually don't think this is present, I do not see evidence of whatever the rubric criterion is that you're referring to. So having that rubric right in front of you is really important. Having that response, the attachments, is also really important. Another thing I'm going to flag for you is parroting or mimicking the rubric language exactly. So we know that you can have a strong response that will use rubric language. It's actually one of our suggestions is to use it in a rich way. But in this example, you will see places where it's limited and it is literally copying rubric language and not providing support. So that's an area to look out for. If you see that, note it. And I think that's a great place to discuss within our groups. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes on your own. As you're going through, annotate, highlight, what questions do you have, what evidence is present. After the 15, we're going to come back within our table groups, and we're going to share out those two areas of what evidence is present, what else can be developed, And then we will have a whole group discussion to wrap up, just thinking of the ELA example. As you're working, if you have pressing questions, concerns, or you just want a thought partner, obviously reach out to us, but we do want to protect that 15 minutes to have some good work time before we connect across. All right, we'll go ahead and start the clock, and in 15, we'll bring us back together. I'm noticing so much rich discussion, some really quality questions. Some are easier to answer than others, which is a great thing. We all know that those good questions really develop and move us forward in this process collectively. So thank you, keep them coming. In just a moment, we are going to anchor back into the rubric criteria, which you have in front of you, but we're also going to have displayed so we can all talk about the same things. I think Andy was going to make a clarification point real quick out of one of those great questions that we had come up today.
Sure, just a bit of clarification. So for 3A, 3B, 3C, and 3D, we're treating those as separate questions. So the word limit said that there's 1,500 words per assessment description. Let me re-clarify that for you. That's 1,500 words per narrative response. So you have 1,500 words to respond to 3A. You have 1,500 words to respond to 3B. Okay, does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Great, thank you. So what I'd like to do next is to think about this proposal kind of from top to bottom. And although we would love to have time to go through each bulleted criterion today, I don't think we'll have time to do that. And so instead, we're going to approach this proposal thinking of that first paragraph to start. And we're not limited to that first paragraph, but if we're thinking, what evidence is here that supports the rubric criteria? What are some things that stood out to you? And this could be either this was evidence, really strong evidence, and it clearly aligned to that rubric criteria, or it could be the other of, I saw some of this here, I had a lot of questions, or out of this came more questions. And Becky Cox is going to chime in. She has some pieces here that she also picked up on as taking on the reviewer hat as well. But I'd like for someone in our group to just, and we'll get you a microphone too, if you want to just raise your hand. If you'd like to start us off with what's something that came out of your group discussions, or what's something that you think could require some more discussion. First paragraph of that example response. Yes, we're bringing you a microphone.
Perhaps it was in the way we read it, but we felt like that first paragraph had more to do with an example that would go in program coherence for the building up the gradual release of responsibility toward being able to do the assessment. Because the first paragraph really, there was nothing to support that assessment piece.
So thank you for that. And following up, either you or someone else nearby, what would take it from that gradual release up until actually completing? What do you think could be added to make this paragraph stronger? Besides just specifying further, is there anything else that you would add or you would suggest to add?
Well, there were no scoring mechanisms for this part. It just said they're practicing doing these things. When they do the partner chat or the book talks with a partner, there was no scoring mechanism for that. So it didn't sound like an actual assessment. It sounded like activities that they were doing to lead up to creating the unit that was actually in the second paragraph.
Sure. So I hear you saying adding a scoring mechanism, specifying further to make this more of an assessment and not just the teaching of about complex text. What else? Yes, so what she's saying is adding that modeling in could make this part stronger too, and to specify what it would look like to model, and to add in another step into the gradual release. Becky, do you want to highlight portions of this paragraph that
So I'm gonna come in from the practical lens of what we're seeing in the field and kind of contrast. This could meet the rubric, yet I also want to infuse a little bit more around the room about enhancements that we can make for our pre-service teachers. One of those things is the idea of two texts. What conversations did we have around the room with two texts in this paragraph? Any connections there? So this starts to dip its toes into pairing of texts, but not necessarily that idea of a text set and how that text set can be multifaceted and really drive intentionally toward those understandings, those universal concepts and those other understandings that we're trying to gain. So that's a really important thing for us to continue to focus on with our candidates is how texts are coming together in strongly intentional ways as we build them. Another piece that I want to pull out from this paragraph is the text analysis practice. Just kind of this, again, a practical kind of infusion of what we're seeing. Sometimes we're seeing, we have the text analysis that happens, and it's a great process at the beginning, and then it is set aside. So it's a really important thing for us to help our candidates see how that text analysis is infused then in the lesson sequence. For instance, if there are places where we see the text is qualitatively rigorous, how are we then pulling that those areas into our question sequences and giving our students opportunities to really think through those areas where the text is rigorous, more rigorous. What other elements did you see?
Strategies. For example, when you turn around and right on the very top where it says think aloud and that there were no strategies at all.
I don't know if you heard that back there, but she's saying there weren't necessarily strategies or tools to help support the thinking.
And I'd like to piggyback on that. If you'll turn to, sorry, I have a two-pager. You'll look down at the lower part of your proposal. I think it's in the last paragraph. And some of you might have already highlighted where instructional strategies are talked about and they are mentioned. This is one of those examples of mimicking the rubric language. That's very clear. That is not fully developed. Even that all of a sudden it's mentioned in the very last paragraph just shows a lack of development, a lack of clarity. So I wanted to highlight that one for you to say, yes, technically it's there, check it off the list. However, it is not developed. As a reviewer, I would still have questions to say, what about this? And how did candidates choose these strategies? And what background knowledge and content knowledge do they have to even choose them to begin with? So this is an area that is underdeveloped, and I'm very glad that you picked up on that as well. What other areas, either tension points or you still have more questions or you would want this response to go deeper and to provide more evidence? Yes, we will. Can you?
I'm fine. So I have a clarifying question on this. I was a little bit concerned because it appears from just reading the prompt and the rubric that this should be very focused on this assessment where my teacher candidates demonstrate their ability to analyze and then use texts.
Mm-hmm.
But in this, it talks about the formative work that I, as the instructor, do with my students, which doesn't necessarily lead to the assessment. I mean, it's a formative assessment, but this is focused on more like the summative assessment. Am I understanding that correctly? So do I embed the formative assessments that lead to the summative, or do I just focus on my students' final demonstration of mastery?
Well, I want to highlight, especially the comments we've already had, that gradual release. It is strong to include that gradual release from instructor or coursework and this beginning place. I don't think you have to elaborate. This example response does include more detail. That could be even 1 or 2 sentences to say, this is where it's coming from, especially if this is earlier in coursework or you have students who are just entering into their program. Depending on where they are in their experience, they might need that. And so if not, perhaps this is during student teaching and it's their last semester. I would specify that too, to say they already have this developed understanding. We are drawing upon X, Y, and Z. Annie, do you want to add to that?
And just to clarify too, we're not necessarily looking for just summative assessments, so there can be formative assessments. These are within program assessments, that's what we're looking for. And so there can be some background knowledge as was laid out here that's supporting, that there's a little bit more detail that's provided to understand what's going on in coursework to support the assessment that will be assigned to candidates to really drive at selecting using analyzed complex text. So we don't want to prescribe for you all that this has to be a summative test. It needs to, or a summative assessment needs to be a within program assessment, could be formative, could be summative. Helpful? Oh, talk loud here.
So I thought a little bit of clarification needed to be done with regard to field placement. And perhaps it's just because someone reading this from this person's institution would understand it clearly. So, and I think that kind of goes to what she was just saying right then, with the whole formative and their background knowledge. So I think the way this person could remedy this would be to have someone at a peer institution take a look at it and questions back and forth, which is what some of us did in the first round. And we read each other's and we asked questions back and forth, and that helped. It helped me to clarify my questions, the questions that I was answering when someone from another institution read it, because that person didn't have the background knowledge that I had, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And one of our points that was specified during the webinar was to write for an audience outside of your EPP. And we know that it's really challenging to do sometimes. And the way that we can overcome that is exactly what you're suggesting, is to develop a partnership, to have someone else read this with a fresh lens that's outside of your, not even outside of your department, but also outside of your EPP completely. Another thing to keep in mind is this is one question that is within the entire proposal. So even though this is 3A, perhaps, let's just pretend that field experiences or where this course lies within your program is already specified. And if it was, hypothetically, then you could refer back to that. So having those specificities earlier within the template, you can use to your advantage to make it even more clear for reviewers. But thank you for that.
There's absolutely no research in that draft. We just saw this evidence at the bottom, the strong response to the from research. And there would be plenty of opportunities to research, like why do you use essentially placement with small groups?
Yes.
What do you think about that? Or other parts, why do you then choose?
Yes, and this is actually another question we got from the table in the back earlier today that's saying, hey, nowhere in here has it said that we must include research, and yet our strong examples happen to include those. So my answer to that would be, we have seen very strong examples that embed research citations, and we have seen very strong examples that did not. As a reviewer, I want to know with confidence that this EPP is approaching and considering and embedding the rubric criteria, and I need to know that. One way, one option of doing that and providing very strong evidence is to include how we know why this is, especially within my example, the instructional strategies piece that is underdeveloped. That would be a great place for me to include why and how. You can go about doing the why and how in a lot of different ways, but one option to provide stronger support is to include research and to embed those citations. So it is not required. And even there was a suggestion earlier, I think from Tricia, to even provide some more examples to show, and we have those. I think it's something we can easily follow up with, to show other strong examples that link directly to rubric criteria and meet expectations that do not include citations. So just know that is not required, and yet it is an option to provide further support. Okay? Yes.
One of the things that I didn't see much of in this assessment, it was a lot about complexity, but I didn't see much about quality literature. And then students, teacher candidates were expected to not only analyze for complexity, but to actually choose literature that is quality literature. Because there's a lot of complex text that's not quality. And that is mentioned in the rubric language.
Yes. I see Becky nodding in agreement. Do you want to add to that, Becky? Is there anything you want
I
to
think
say?
it's well
Go.
stated.
Yes, so this is an area that could further develop this response is by adding in the quality analysis and to add in scoring mechanisms for that, correct? Like both on the candidate end and even if I were to score this candidate assessment, what would I use as an instructor? Is there anything else that could be related to what we've already talked about or something new that stuck out to you as being strong or underdeveloped?
We felt like the section referencing diverse cultural and linguistic experiences of students was somewhat underdeveloped. And certainly when you look through the supporting evidence, it's not assessed or followed up on in any way.
So especially, something for me when I was reading this response seemed to almost check off that bullet to say, okay, well I did it, and here it is, it's in this paragraph. And what, not only scoring it, but also embedding throughout. Back to your, what are quality complex texts? But we should be mentioning diverse text choices throughout and not just isolated, to your point. That's a great point. Yes.
I think I'll be okay. To me, it seemed like the narrative response and the assignment guidelines given to students did not match at all. The narrative response asked much more of students than what they included as attachments.
So if I'm the one writing this response, I want to be really careful at my attachment choices and making sure that it's highlighting what I want it to highlight. That would be good feedback for the person who did this. Sorry, go ahead.
So I have a few other just content-related pedagogical pieces in relationship to literacy in the field, just to make sure I'm sharing with the Read to Ready Coaching Network. Our semester 5 content is around small group instruction. Now this particular proposal is more about adolescent literacy, middle and secondary. One of the things I do want to share though is you'll see a reference to determine the range of reading levels and abilities. So just to kind of infuse a little bit about that small group information that we've shared, it's been really more about the developmental stages of readers and writers and how we intentionally group through homogeneous and heterogeneous grouping in effective ways. So it's less about finding this one specific level, it's more about understanding the learner and their phases and the behaviors that are displayed. So that was an important thing that caught my attention as I read through as far as content-related pedagogy and kind of where we're trying to head about really understanding the learner. Another piece that caught my attention, example topics or concepts may include technology, identity, or opportunity. And that technology one kind of caught my attention because that might be a difficult concept. Like when we think about driving back to universal concepts, how do we drive back to that? So kind of really thinking about concepts in unit design as we shared with teaching literacy in Tennessee.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up or discuss more that stuck out to you in this response? So our last little bit in this session about what do we do from here with particular to ELA, middle and secondary. Thinking of what we talked about, the remaining questions, perhaps some good topics to take back to your faculty. Maybe we need to talk through this and see exactly what already exists that we can use and how we move forward. But I want you to take a second and either jot this down, or if you want to talk with someone within your EPP that's close by, or another EPP at your table. But what are your next steps as you're thinking of drafting specifically for the ELA middle and secondary proposal? And also, what additional questions do you have after today's discussion? So maybe you have more questions, or maybe you've gotten some questions answered. So think of these two questions as we kind of close out today's session for ELA.
Attention briefly, I wanted to make a couple additional remarks about this example. And I definitely don't want to keep you from lunch, which is next. Some really great dialogue we're having here too. I want to also assure you that even though our literacy network meeting is today and proposals are due in January, our technical support will not cease between now and then. This is not the only opportunity to talk with us. Lindsay and I are happy to set up phone calls and navigate some of these specific questions that you have. But I also want to reiterate again that third objective today in reaching out. Just as Kim had said, Kim, you all have 5 EPPs in your sort of emergent network outside of this literacy network. Is that right? How often y'all meet together?
Angela helped with the Elisa. Maybe 3 weeks, Crystal, 3 times maybe, at least. Some of us are together.
Even smaller groups, right? Okay. So there's really, again, power in that collaboration. The other thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of the folks that have been chiming in today happen to be our literacy reviewers. And I think that they've all been trained to look very critically at these responses. And so one of the opportunities that will be presented, and I'll have to touch base with Shay about this when we're actually going to publish the call for reviewers, but we encourage all of you in this room to think about being a reviewer. And I think that any reviewers in this room might tell you that that experience helped deepen their own knowledge, and to be able to look at what other programs are doing across the state would only benefit their own programs. So I just really want to encourage you all. It is also compensated, if that makes a difference. We'll have more information about that in the next couple weeks. But that might be another opportunity to just continue to deepen your knowledge about what we're asking for and what these requirements are. We are going to transition to lunch here shortly. Let me give you a preview of the next couple hours of our day. We're going to have you exit the room here shortly. And Michael, is it a buffet that's set up over there? Okay, so we'll make a couple lines and head down our buffet. There's no required working to do during lunchtime other than just collaborating, continuing having these discussions with your peers. You're welcome to sit in here while you're working or while you're eating. And then what we'll do at 12:45, we'll transition and have our instructional leader group in here. And that means if you're an EPP that would rather not be part of that conversation or don't offer an instructional leader program, please remember that you can go to the breakout rooms and continue working and developing, where our TDOE staff will be floating and supporting with specific questions. Okay, so we'll kind of wrangle you at 12:40 to remind you where to go as lunch is wrapping up. Okay? All right, we're going to open the doors and prepare for our lunch break. To instructional leader proposals. Before we get deep into a discussion, there's a resource that we heard back in our July Literacy Network meeting that would be helpful to have in front of you as you were doing this work and thinking about the alignment of the EPP literacy standards into instructional leader programs. And so the idea came from you all at the July Literacy Network meeting to have a resource that we have in the left side of your red folder. And what we're calling it is the TILS EPP Literacy Standards Crosswalk. And so we created this document for a dual purpose. First of all, we heard it's valuable for you all, and we wanted to ensure that we were able to create that for you to use as a resource as you're drafting your responses. And two, we want you all to see how the alignment between these two sets of standards, and that we're not thinking about these as discrete sets of standards. In fact, the creation of the proposal rubrics was very intentional in thinking about here's where the TILs, here's the TILs standards, here's what instructional leader programs are currently thinking about. Here are these new EPP literacy standards and the connections in that regard. And then the proposal requirements were derived after making that crosswalk. So it was a thoughtful approach, and we're hoping that that having that tool of your crosswalk might provide some additional guidance or thinking as you're going through that drafting process. So again, just a resource there for you to use as you would like. So we had plans for walking this group through an example for instructional leader. In fact, we created 2 examples for you. And again, these follow the same the same idea that these are examples and not exemplars. We developed one to address question number 2 on the instructional leader program proposal, and then also question 4. But in talking with our team and hearing some of the thoughts that you all had already raised today, we wanted to sort of provide a choice today to best use our time. We could either continue as we had considered and thinking about walking you through an example to address question number 2. And give you independent time to review it, give you table talk time to go talk about it as a whole group. Or we can kind of switch gears a little bit. And I know I'll let Michael speak to this, but we've been hearing a few sort of broader questions about program design in general, and the need to have some sort of broader discussion about what is our program design for instructional leaders? How are we beginning to even think about the integration of standards within these programs? Michael, would you like to add to that? What else were you hearing?
Sure, you kind of hit the main topics there, but I've heard from a few folks that it might be useful to have this kind of broader conversation, mainly because this is a significant shift in thinking, right? Looking at the content in your instructional leader programs at this level of depth. But prior to that, needing to have some discussion about how clinical practice is structured, how your leader prep program interacts with the primary folks in your teacher prep program who may have the strong literacy background that's needed to be able to do this well in your instructional leader program. There also, from a state policy perspective, there's not a really prescriptive description of what clinical practice has to look like, so we know that it looks kind of different across programs, so there may be a need to have some conversation about what does successful integration with the literacy standards throughout clinical practice look like in these various structures. So we just wanted to pause for a moment and see if this is resonating with some folks, and if so, we can certainly carve out some of this hour to do a few different things, but I think what might be the most useful is to have some cross-EPP conversations about how you're thinking about approaching some of this work. Keeping in mind, and I reminded some folks of this just earlier, that this is a proposal that would be implemented next fall. So we know that there are going to have to be some shifts made to be able to address these successfully. So again, we want to give you an opportunity to kind of respond to what we're saying and what we're hearing, and let us know if you think it'd be valuable to have some of this time either with your EPP to talk about these sorts of things or across EPP before we dig into the sample response that we have. Any thoughts? show of hands, how many people would see value in a portion of this hour being spent on some of the things we just talked about? Raise your hand. So pretty much everybody. Show of hands, how many would like to do that just in your own EPP? Wow, look at that. So seems to me like everyone thinks, it's almost unanimous, that this would be worth engaging in across EPP. So I can't tell just from looking around the room if we have a mix of folks at every table, but why don't we spend some time just making sure that we do, and then you all can kind of have your own table talk discussions about the sorts of things you've been thinking about, some of the barriers you're coming up against as you're thinking about this. And then I think the idea would be that you're kind of shopping some of this with some of the other people at the table so that you can kind of get some thought partnering around this approach. We would then float around the room, support as we can, but really I think this would be led by you, and we can kind of just read the room. If we're feeling like this is something we want to continue for the full hour, we could do that, but I think we'd also like to spend a little bit of time diving into the example if possible, but we can kind of play that by ear. So why don't you look around your table and make sure you have representation from at least 2 EPPs. So if you're at a table kind of by yourself, yes, Rick.
Mike, can I ask a question before you get started?
You may.
I have no problem with that, but going back to your clinical questions and things like that. So, knowing how literacy and leadership necessarily do not mix like water and oil sometimes, only from a background experience. Because a lot of leaders don't have the experience from, tell me if I'm wrong, just tell me shut up, Rick, and I'll sit down.
I'm not going to tell you to shut up.
Just tell me to sit down. But when I'm thinking of, and I've been putting a lot of thought into this in my clinical experiences, because I want these people to have some rich experiences with what's going on in the schools. So I'm going to put a lot of my responsibility on sitting in on PLC meetings, to do team evaluation, to do, what's the one, achieve the core, because Shelby County uses a ILP guideline for literacy. Am I saying that right? Anybody knows what the achieve the core rubric is for questioning and stuff like that? I'm the only one here who knows that. Okay, there's an I.
We believe you.
Okay. IGA is what it is. IGA is an instructional guide from Achieve the Core, and they use it across the system. So I'm looking at that kind of depth, but it's not as depth as a teacher of literacy in the schools. So I'm trying to find a nice breakaway between, we're not teaching literacy candidates who teach it.
Right.
I want them to be aware of what's going on in the school, so because question 4 gets to, how do you then find teachers? How do you put your resources into that? Those are the kind of things I'm wondering. So I don't know if we can share that as a group before we talk here, or after.
I think you're on the right, I mean, I will speak for myself, but I think you're on the right track. I was loosely involved in the development of these standards. There were some other folks, I don't know if there are any in the room that were involved in the group, the working group that developed these standards, but language like foundational understanding is there for a reason. And then this alignment we did with the TILs, we did that for a reason because we wanted you to think kind of the way you're describing about systems and structures that need to be in place for a leader to be able to support a school's growth in literacy, but not skirting the fact that they need to have that foundational understanding, right? But they may not have it at the level of depth that other folks have. So, anything you'd want to add?
No, I think that's exactly right. And again, to take it a step further and acknowledging what and leveraging the resources that they do have to be able to move that forward. So very intentional design. Again, there's a lot of what the TILs already asks that we're asking again to just narrow the focus a bit on literacy.
Is that resonating with folks, or does that make sense? Yes.
I might be the only one that's having this problem. But I don't want to spend too much time on that and not see some of these examples.
Is anybody else feeling that way?
Anybody else is afraid that we're not going to spend?
Because we might also be able to split this group up a little bit if that's useful.
Okay, I just just wanna make sure we.
Sure. So why don't we do this, because we have until 1:45, is that right? So why don't we have the table talk that we just described, we will float until about 25 after, does that sound?
Yeah, I think if we leaked a little bit into the break, it would be okay, as long as you all know that you can take a break whenever you'd like, so we can buy us a couple extra.
And then we'll shift gears to make sure that you all get a chance to have some conversations about the examples.
Does
Sound
that
good?
seem right?
All right, so we'll be floating around, but feel free at your tables to designate some folks to be kind of facilitators to start this conversation, but we'll be floating around as you can. Make sure as you're having these conversations, you bring out that alignment document and the rubric and the proposal document as appropriate. Because I think that if you start to veer into the direction of having kind of more high-level questions about what this is about and what we're trying to do, you might be able to find some of those answers in those documents. Okay, one thing to note, we got a couple questions about this. Yes, there are 10 literacy standards for instructional leader preparation programs. It is just a formatting error on the alignment document. It says 8, that should say 10. So we have not dropped the standard. Another thing I wanted to note is that the tildes have been modified slightly. The state board approved the revisions to the tildes just, gosh, is this still October? Yes. Earlier this month, I believe. It is now a separate policy, and the changes that have been made weren't radical or drastic. It was really to better align with the 2015 PSEL revision, so things like equitable access and that language that you're seeing in the standards, that comes out of that revision. So just wanted to note that. We were hoping, if you'll notice, we stopped a little bit before 25 after. We were hoping we'd get a couple brave souls to share something interesting that you heard or an idea that you had based on your conversations, or maybe you already had the idea and you just thought that it would be worth sharing. Either something that you're thinking about doing as an instructional leader prep program to meet the expectations of the literacy standards, or something you heard that another EPP is doing that you found to be interesting. Every time I make eye contact, folks are looking away. Yes. And that's who you are.
Okay, yeah. I'm Ben Phillips at Union University. I'd actually like to get y'all's reaction to something. So my knee-jerk reaction was that we would put a literacy course into our IL curriculum. And for our master's level, we did, and now I'm going through the process of modifying our EDS and EDD level curriculum, and all of our instructional leaders will take a literacy course. Specifically leadership-focused literacy courses. I'm now getting the impression, as I dig more into this, that that's not enough. What's your reaction to that?
I think, first of all, it's amazing that you're building a literacy-specific course within your instructional leader program. So, again, you'll never hear from us the way that we would prescribe how you do this. I think there's been a lot of conversation we have with both tables over here about what is foundational understanding, right? And you can really think about that, and one course might do that, or a systematic approach to thinking about embedding literacy specific to assessment, to content knowledge, to instruction throughout your program. That could be one way to do that too. It's just a matter of bringing this awareness to the understanding of what is literacy within your courses. And so you'll never hear from us a way to prescribe what that looks like. I think it's remarkable that you're all taking a literacy course in there. That's not anything that we would say that you have to do in your program. I think there's a lot of ways, the structures and mechanisms that Michael was talking about before are already in place. to develop a specific scope or lens on literacy, a spotlight on literacy, if you will, and build that in. So it's remarkable. It's not a requirement. There's a lot of ways to consider the integration of these standards within these programs. Did anybody have any other thoughts about that? Tell them, Rick.
We thought about that, we were talking about that at our table also, and then I don't want to add another 3 hours to a program where it takes something away, and it begins to, what am I going to, can't keep adding more and more and more to your curriculum. So, and then I keep thinking about, when's math going to be done next time? They're going to add math, and we add another class of that, and social studies, literacy, and all the other things to it. That was my first thought. The second thought is, I want literacy to be built over time so that everything is, I want them to understand the foundational skills first, and then start looking for, when they're doing the supervision class, to observe a literacy teacher. So that's where their focus is. So it builds over a year or 2 years rather than, okay, you've done with literacy, let's move on to something else. That's all.
There are lots of ways to consider what this looks like in your program.
So take your existing courses that you already have and look at your standards, your EPPs, and then your other standards, and then integrate those into the courses that you already have in existence, because then literacy spans the program instead of one course.
That's certainly one approach. That's what this table was talking about too. Like a starting point is our instructional leader programs are already aligned to the TILs. Now we have this crosswalk, and we can be thoughtful about where this crosswalk is aligning to the EPP literacy standards, and then think about where there may be gaps or holes that can be enriched by rethinking certain components of that program.
So since I'm a literacy person, you know, that's my world that I love, that I'm passionate about.
Okay.
So why not, we're friends, guys. Why not have a literacy course early on in the program that does some introductions? You know, what is literacy? What is foundational literacy? What is discipline literacy? What does it look like in the classroom? Embed some experience, some observations into that course early on, but at the same time integrate the literacy into your other courses, 1 or 2 standards. But then you have an intro literacy course that establishes the foundation. Just like we do in all other programs, we have an intro literacy course that starts the foundation and then builds on that. You know, because now our math students have to take literacy courses, initial licensure. And so why not leadership?
Yeah, that's certainly a thoughtful approach.
It's a thoughtful approach?
It is.
It's a thoughtful approach. Our leadership guys, and they're yes, sir.
I'm not sure what political office you're running from. Political response. I think the question is it acceptable? And I think that was the question Ben was talking about. Is it acceptable? You know,
Our answer is we're not going to prescribe how you do this, how you structure. I mean, all of these are possible avenues for doing that. Was that also a political? Did a little better in saying, yes, you can do it this way. These are not, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's going to be dependent on your organization, the resources you have, the structures you already have in place, the expertise that you have on campus. So there are a lot of different ways you could get at this. We're not going to tell you it must be this way and it can't be that way. I know some folks really want to hear that.
Because the natural tension is, while your background is literacy, I think what some of us are experiencing is our faculty members and adjunct, many of them, that's not their background. And to say to my faculty member who teaches legal issues in school governance, you're going to have to find an assignment that I've got to write about in this proposal that's going to be a spotlight on literacy, he's going to look back at me and say, what?
Which is to say you don't have to do it that way, right?
Then you can offer the literacy course.
Yes. Okay.
My thought is that we could modify the practicum project to a degree and something we're already doing, so it wouldn't add something else. And you could require that evaluation panel to meet with the person on the front end when they make the proposal. And at that time, make suggestions of how this thing could be improved to fly, because you're gonna have people in there that have no academic background as far as academics are concerned. They are teaching physical education. Some of your counselors may be in that same situation. There may be others. So we could rather require the evaluation panel to be made up of people with the background in this area, so that they could advise them on the front end. And then when the project is over, and we start them out in the first semester, they have to propose that by the first semester, and then they can finish it by the beginning of their last semester. So by that time, when they get ready to finish up, the evaluation panel will evaluate how well they did that during that time. I think that would be a good solution, something we're already doing, just modify it a little bit.
I saw Jeff get really excited in the back. I think he might have been thinking about the exact same thing. We've got
This gentleman up here was obviously telepathic to me, because, you know, we were thinking the same way. I think that as our students go through their internship, we need to build in a component that he or she works collaboratively with their mentor, and they create a literacy component, but we also support that in the coursework. We're not gonna write a bunch of additional courses on this table. We're not doing it. But we can strengthen what we have, and we can make sure that what we have is aligned. Anyway, those are my reflections.
Let me clarify. We've been given initiatives from our universities that we cannot add any more courses. I mean, we have very limited funding. A lot of our independent universities just can't. And so with that, we do what we can with what we are given, right? So, you know, every situation is not in the same boat. I mean, every university is not in the same boat. We're given directives, we have to follow them from our our program, our universities.
Yeah,
So-
that's part of the reason why
Right.
we're allowing this type of flexibility, because you're not all in the same place.
Right.
Okay, we have just under 15 minutes. What do you think? It's kind of tight.
It is tight. I do want to provide for you the opportunity to just maybe start reading over that example number 2. And if at the very least what you can do is kind of skip the independent review, but jump to your table talks to kind of negotiate that example language with the rubric criteria to just kind of get y'all thinking about this example, where are there areas of strength and maybe some areas to further develop, especially given in light of the discussion that we had. Does that seem reasonable in the next 15 minutes or so? And we'll continue to float. So taking a peek at that example for number 2.
Also just wanted to say thank you all for that kind of change of agenda there. I think it was really helpful to hear from you all what you're thinking, and hopefully that you found that as useful for our time here. Thank you.
Hey everybody, we have concluded our hour together for instructional leaders. We hope you found some value in the discussion we had first, and then were able to maybe at least take a look at that example for question 2. Just so y'all know, we actually developed 2 examples for instructional leaders, so that if you looked at example 2 today, feel free to take example 4 back to your faculty to continue to negotiate that language and whether or not it's meeting expectations. And again, we just continue to encourage you to talk with one another outside of the network to garner these ideas and build those proposals. Are there any last sort of comments about your discussions today? Anything you wanted to share, or a lingering question that anybody has? Any final thoughts? Got it all figured out. Michael, any final thoughts? Well, lovely. We are going to take a break from now until 2 o'clock. If you'd like to join the conversation about the non-ELA, CTE, and pre-K-12 programs, that will start in this room at 2 o'clock. Otherwise, feel free to use the breakout rooms to continue your discussions with your colleagues. Okay? We'll see you back here at 2 if you're taking part of the conversation. All right, everybody, welcome back. We are going to have our last sort of session on our non-ELA middle and secondary CTE and pre-K-12 programs. I wanted to provide a little bit of advice. I think if there is any webinar that you have not viewed, they're all very important, but I think the most essential is probably this non-ELA pre-K-12 and CTE program proposal webinar. The difference between this webinar that we hosted comparatively with the other two is that we still lay out all of the proposal requirements and rubric criteria, but there's also this sort of educative piece about the shift in standards from sort of content area focus to disciplinary literacy. And if you're less familiar about the research in that area, we've tried to do a couple things. We try to give really practical examples in the webinar to get folks to be thinking about what those expectations are. We also provided a few articles to read, the Shanahan and the other Shanahan and then the ILA. And speaking of which, we also started a reference list. You might have seen that in your folder. This is not nearly as comprehensive as it could be. And we actually are asking for your help in that regard. If there are other wonderful academic journal articles, textbooks, things that have been really helpful in thinking about any of the proposal requirements that you think are worth sharing, then I encourage you to send it to either me or to Lindsay, and we can update this reference list and then send it out to everybody that might find some use in there. But we scoured all the articles on there and found them helpful in many ways. So we hope that you'll make use of that reference list and contribute, because we could all benefit from your expertise in these areas and the things that you have found helpful. So I seem to have lost my clicker. This will do it manually today. We're going to transition, talk a little bit about this last group here. Now, the materials are pretty much everything else, thanks, that we haven't addressed in your folder. And what we decided to do is to include the guidance document that we published. And if you remember that from reading the EPP update, within that guidance document, all of the individual templates for how we have clustered these next sets of endorsement, those are all included within that guidance document. So we felt like the best way, since this one tends to be, we have a very large number of endorsements that are covered in this group, we thought it might be helpful to kind of walk through an example of what this might look like and to provide some clarity on what our expectations are. I want to say first and foremost, we do not get as granular with this set of proposals as we do with the others. Okay, I want to just say that right off the bat, and then we will provide for you some examples on what our expectations are. To be honest with you, if we asked for all of those proposal requirements to cover every single endorsement we have, we wouldn't even be able to manage the review. It's just a lot, and that would be a very heavy lift on you, be a heavy lift on us, and so we'll be looking for a sampling in relation to the comprehensive questions. We'll talk about that here today. Okay, so if there's the document that's called the non-ELA middle secondary CTE pre-K-12 proposal guidelines. It looks like this. You're probably familiar, has that table on the front. Probably familiar if you've been subscribing to our EPP update or watched the webinar. You want to have that one in front of you, and within that packet, we're going to walk through an example of a middle secondary social studies template with an example response today. We'll show you an example of what a matrix would look like, some attachments, and then the rubric for question 1, since that's the example that we will walk through. So on this very first page, you'll see a table here, and I want to make a few clarifications on this table. This first table summarizes all of the endorsements that are covered with this proposal process. You can see that the middle and secondary are broken down in math, science, and social studies, and we've got the secondary, biology, chemistry, etc. in there. But you'll notice at the top there, it says middle and secondary excluding ELA, special POPs, and instructional leader. The reason for that is because those programs are covered by other proposal requirements. The special populations has already been covered with our first round, right? So if you are an EPP that has a program that's like a specialized deaf, hard of hearing, or vision, those programs are not covered. These standards will not be covered within those programs. So they are excluded altogether from this process. Okay? In the next group, CTE, these are all of our academic programs. So if you're an EPP that offers occupational, well, first of all, you know kind of where that all is. And the occupational for right now is excluded from this process. And what we wrote in that note is that the proposal review for occupational CTE programs will be included in the broader SAP review process. And if you're an EPP that offers that occupational and have questions about that, we can talk at a later date. Finally, pre-K-12, we're excluding, like I said, the special education vision and hearing, audiologists, reading specialists for now, school counselor, etc. So if you offer any of those programs, they are not covered with this proposal process. Just want to make that really clear. What you'll notice at the bottom with the timeline is these are staggered a little bit, right? So we're essentially covering 3 huge groups of endorsements, and we needed to stagger to manage the review process. So any endorsements that are covered with on this proposal process, they will be due February 22nd. So you have I think that's about a month, right? So ELA, middle secondary, instructional leader, that's January 28th. These will all be due February 22nd. And then these will follow the same sort of iterative review cycle. So EPPs will receive notification of needs, expectations, or need for revisions April 22nd. And then if revisions should be necessary, that will occur in May. And should a second round of revisions be necessary, that will be due in July, and we'll target those dates as the review process is underway. Still, the expectation is that those standards will be implemented in the fall of 2019. I just want to reiterate some of those to navigate some of the questions that we got about that. Okay, so on page 2, there's language at the top. This is just a copy and paste from page 2. The department is prescribing how the endorsements should be covered on a single proposal. And so there is a list on the bottom of page 2 that shows if you're an EPP that offers middle and or secondary math, that's going to be on proposal 1. It's a separate proposal, okay? If you're an EPP that offers middle and secondary science, which would include middle grade science or biology, chemistry, earth science, physics, computer science, those would all be covered on proposal 2. Okay, Kim?
What if our EPP has an approved middle grades math and science program?
Like a dual endorsement program? So that's a great question, and when we look at a template, you'll see a place where you can make a check mark that this endorsement is covered, is a dual endorsement program. We're treating them discreetly, but you can make a check mark that shows. Right. Do you also have a standalone math program? Okay, so it's only part of the dual? Okay. Angela?
So like the social studies economics
That's right. Yep.
And Annie, this includes add-on endorsements as well?
No.
Can you clarify your question?
We have an add-on endorsement for middle grade.
What you don't have an initial? My understanding you had to. Let's talk about that after the fact, but I thought that was the case. But we as you probably saw if you participated in the staff audit, we've been trying to really clarify the difference between a dual endorsement program and an initial licensure program and an additional endorsement program. It gets very confusing very quickly. So if you have questions on that front, especially since this proposal covers so many different areas that you may offer in various shapes and sizes, you can talk to us after the fact and we can make sure that we figure out exactly what makes the most sense for our commercial. Did everybody hear that in the back? Sorry, I didn't grab a mic.
Yes, ma'am.
So, for the middle and secondary math, we have a middle grade state endorsement initial licensure and I understood that I would one proposal that would encompass both of those.
That's right.
I thought I heard you say to her you needed two separate.
Well, she had a dual math and science. So if you can see here, so math is on proposal 1 and then math and math. Yep.
We were told you could do two.
Real confusing.
I'm sorry, I missed something.
We were told you could do two, middle and then also secondary.
Where did you hear that?
Lindsay.
Can we, MTSU can we talk about your program at a later date? Because I think you guys may have some exceptions. Can we talk about that? Okay. Okay, so no matter what proposal you're completing, in fact, the proposals look almost the same minus the endorsements, right? So if you have a math program, then you're going to have part 1, an identification of endorsement section, and then you'll have the matrix section, and then you'll have the comprehensive questions. So it literally looks the same with the exception of the endorsements that are covered on each proposal, okay? And I want to show you an example of what this looks like. So within the packet that you have, we're actually going to walk through an example so you can see one that's completed. If you flip to the next page, you should see Proposal 3, Middle and Secondary Social Studies. So this would be an example if I was an EPP that offered any endorsement that's listed under Proposal 3 that falls in the category of social studies, then you would complete this template. So my pretend EPP, out of all of the endorsements listed that could possibly be listed on Proposal 3, my EPP offers econ, geography, and history. Okay, it's just hypothetical. So what that would look like if you were completing a proposal in Part 1, what you would do if you flip to the next page where you see Part 1, identification of endorsements, what you would do here is you would check, okay, well I have econ, so I'm going to check a box for econ. Do we not have econ on there? I apologize, I think social studies was supposed to be in red there, my mistake. Social studies should be in red there at econ. So social studies 6A, there would be an undergrad and post-bac. We offer it at the job embedded level, clinical type, and student teaching. Same thing with geography. Sorry, these aren't in red. What we offer, government, history, and social studies. My apologies, I'm not sure why that's misaligned. So history, we would check undergrad, post-bac, student teaching, job embedded. The bottom line here is whatever you offer, you're going to check the appropriate clinical endorsement type, the program level, and then the clinical type. Does that make sense? All this is doing is showing the endorsements that you offer and to what level at your EPP. Oh, there, my example on the screenshot is aligned. I apologize that the packet doesn't say the same thing. So this is what an example would look like. Again, if you offered econ, geography, and history, then you would check the box, econ, whatever level, clinical type, geography, whatever level, clinical type, and then history down below. Does that make sense? I apologize for that misalignment. So the second part of this is showing just the breadth of coverage, and this is something that EPPs are very used to. It's a matrix alignment. We've already listed on the side the actual standards over to the left, and then what you'll do is you'll list the course name and clinical names at the top and simply check the box if those courses are the ones that will integrate those standards. And you'll do that for every endorsement that you've checked on part 1. So if you offer econ, geography, and history, then every course within those endorsement areas that cover those EPP literacy standards, you'll write those courses across the top and make the appropriate checkbox for those standards. Does that make sense? Just a real simple coverage. Yes, ma'am?
Do we have this digital, this packet that I'm using?
We do.
Is it on the?
Is it on the flash drive? Yep, should be on the flash
Okay,
drive,
thank
also
you.
published in the EPP update.
Thank you.
Tricia?
What about the clinical name row?
Yeah.
I'm not clear on how that.
So just like if you offer like a early field, any clinical experience, it's like EdPrac 401, then you would write that in there. So any clinical experience that would embed these standards might just be the implementation standard, for example.
Okay, so we have multiple clinicals that align differently depending on when you're in the program with the different content courses. So it's not going to be a one-to-one alignment vertically.
So this is only alignment to the EPP literacy standards. So if you have a clinical experience that's embedding one of these literacy standards, then you would write that clinical experience and then check the appropriate box. If you don't, then you don't have to add that on there. Does that answer your question?
I'm still fuzzy. The first row, is that to be, is one of those rows the name of the course, like the course number, and the second one is the name of the course?
On this example, that's not here. I know,
Oh, I'm right. I'm so sorry. Oh, you're fine.
Yeah. No, I think what's misleading is the example in here. And so what we would expect here is the course name. So if this is like EDUC 300 for the course name, go ahead and write that in there. And in that same box, if you want to write the title, you can, like Social Studies Methods 1 or whatever. Now, if it's a clinical name, it's like an EdPrac 401 early field experience. That's what you would put in the second row. Is that helpful?
So we wouldn't put something in both rows.
Yeah, if you have clinical experiences that align to these standards, then you would put something in that second row.
What was the question you just asked us?
Okay, so I'm not going to put a course.
Correct.
And then also a clinical stacked. I'm going to do this.
Right.
You got
it.
Yep.
Except if I have the course and there's a clinical embedded in that course, then I would put the clinical.
Certainly. That's a good point. So if it's a field experience that's discrete from a course, then you would put it in separate boxes. But if it's a clinical experience that's embedded into a course, then you could leave them one on top of the other. Yeah. Sir?
If we have an undergraduate path and a graduate student path, do we need two of these matrix or two different proposals?
So you're free to complete a matrix in the ways that it makes sense. You can copy and paste a matrix and do it in a way that this is breadth of coverage. It's literally like we want to make sure all of these standards are covered in each of these endorsement areas. So you're free to copy and paste and make as many matrices as makes sense for you.
Okay, so we don't need separate proposals.
Are any of those
No.
courses cross-listed?
Yeah.
Are they cross-listed?
Yeah. So just put both course numbers in one.
Seems to make sense.
That's what we did.
Tricia?
Does the matrix include a place for us to put what program or programs this particular matrix applies to? I'm thinking that would be maybe the first row. Is there a way for us to distinguish?
You certainly could make that notation if you wanted. What we're gonna look at is what did you check in part 1 for endorsements, and then what are you listing in part 2, just kind of holistically. So we don't necessarily need the determination across endorsements, unless you want to organize it in that way.
Like an undergrad and a grad in math.
Mm-hmm.
That are very different courses and very different programs.
Mm-hmm.
We could label one as undergrad and one as...
Sure, like UG or... Yeah, grad. Mm-hmm. Another question?
Yeah, so it says one matrix is required for each proposal,
Mhm.
so you can have more than one?
You can't have more, you at least have to have one. At least have to have one.
So if we have 5 different programs for math, then 5 matrices possibly?
Possibly, sure. Again, this is breadth of coverage. We just want to ensure that they're being covered. I think the real meat to this is our comprehensive questions. Any other? These are good questions.
When it says that you check the boxes that it addresses the standard,
Mhm.
the other proposals, it's pretty clear that introduce, that address this, encompass all of that.
Yep, that's exactly right. Again, we're not going as granular with this one as comparatively with the others. Okay, so comprehensive questions. As you know, there are 5 standards for this particular group. 4 are candidate or student focused, and 1 is the implementation standard. The way that we constructed the comprehensive questions, as we thought about the first 2 being more aligned. The first question, disciplinary specific literacy skills and strategies. And then the second question, academic and discipline specific vocabulary. These are really about the candidate's knowledge, acquisition, and demonstration of these particular things for 1 and 2. The third question that we ask is more focused on the pre-K-12 students when we ask about clinical experiences and the opportunity to practice these skill strategies and vocabulary with students. So one thing I want to say here, and Kim, I'll come back to you in just a second. One thing I want to say here, and this is really important. So if you offer history, government, and econ, what we're looking for in responses to the comprehensive questions are just a sample, okay? So we have some of these EPPs that offer lots of endorsements that would fall under one particular proposal category. When you respond to the comprehensive questions, you'll pick 1 to 2 of those endorsement areas to go into detail to respond to these questions, okay? So you don't have to talk about every program at every level, at every clinical practice, and respond to every single question in that manner. We're looking for 1 to 2 endorsements to respond to answer the comprehensive questions. Does that make sense? Kim?
So my question is about the narrative responses.
Yeah.
So it says limited to 1,500 words. So question 1, you just get 1,500 words, period.
Yep.
To cover your middle and your secondary.
So here's where you would pick one. So if you offer history, geography, and econ, maybe you pick history secondary and respond to that one with question 1.
But you know, I don't know if I'm unique here, but our middle grades program is distinctly different.
Right.
Those kids have to pass the teaching reading elementary.
Mhm.
So if you use only middle school examples,
Mhm.
that's just, there's a lot of assumption there for your secondary folks.
You're right, we have to make this process manageable for everybody. For those who are completing the drafting, the expectation that we have is that if you're doing this in middle grade social studies, then you're also doing it in secondary history, or you're doing it in middle grade or secondary econ, right? And it's a focus on disciplinary skills and strategies, right? So we're just looking for sampling. We have to make this review manageable for both those who are drafting the proposals and those who are reviewing it. But that's a good point. Can't make you accountable for everything. Other questions about that? I want to make sure that's really clear. Okay, so we're going to take a peek at an example response, example not exemplar. What we're going to do is, this particular example is about secondary history, a 612 program. And this program is used to address the 2 opportunities for candidates to attain and demonstrate a deep understanding of discipline-specific literacy skills and strategies essential to their endorsement area. With this particular question, there are 2 verbs that stand out to me, and that's attain and demonstrate. So again, this first question is all about the candidate. How are they going to attain and how are they going to demonstrate discipline-specific literacy skills and strategies? And so what we want you to do, we're going to follow the same structure if you were in the room for the ELA middle and secondary. We're going to have you independently review and just read over the narrative response that's provided right here for question 1. What you'll see behind question 1 is a couple attachments that are used to support. Now, one thing I can tell you about attachments for these proposals is that no attachments are actually required for any of these proposals, but they're optional. So if there's additional course descriptions or syllabi that would be used to support your answer, again, the weight of the response, the rationale should be found in that narrative response first, and then those attachments should be used wisely to support your responses. So you'll see, I think there are 2. The response follows over to the next page. The narrative response does not exceed 1,500 words. And then we've got, I believe, 2 attachments to support. So what we'll do is we'll follow the same kind of structure, give you about, I'm not quite sure what time it is. What is it? 26 after? Okay. Give you about 10 minutes of an independent review, and then we'll transition, talk with your tables about what you're seeing in terms of the response and where it aligns to rubric criteria and where there are some gaps that may need to be addressed. So we'll do an independent review, and then we'll turn to our tables and talk a little bit, and then kind of round out our discussion as a whole group. Does that make sense? Any questions about those directions? All right, we'll go ahead and spend about 10 minutes, and after those 10 minutes, we'll be around to float and support with any table talk conversations you're having. I apologize for not transitioning you to table talk, but you also don't have any problems talking with your neighbors, so I appreciate your collaboration and just hanging in there. This is hard work, a lot of thinking, great discussion so far. So I wanted to just pull this back to our whole group conversation, and again, you have that rubric criteria. We were examining question 1, focused on the candidate, attaining and then demonstrating discipline-specific skills and strategies. So why don't I just kind of open it up and see what are some of these initial reactions, where are you seeing very strong evidence within the example, where might there be opportunities to grow? too. I heard a very nice comment that, man, this seems like it's the ideal, right? This example of this collaboration between content and methods teachers and the ways that these courses are taken concurrently, and is this something that could really ideally happen? Where does this kind of live? So I heard some commentary about that. Does anybody want to respond to that, or did that resonate with anybody? Oh, she don't want to talk. I'll just repeat what she says. Mm-hmm. And what's making sense to you as you're thinking about that redesign? Okay, great. So it does seem like methods course, it kind of makes sense for your program to live there so that they have the opportunity to apply the knowledge that they gain in content area within that course. What you won't hear is a response from us that says we recommend doing this or designing your programs in these ways. There are a lot of really wonderful ways to design programs, to be thinking about this. And that is one approach that may work well for your EPP. Other thoughts? I guess we wore you out today. Oh, Crystal.
I guess at our table we felt like in the first part, the first two parts, they were having the opportunity through the modeling to attain that knowledge. And then through the project type things that they were doing, that they were demonstrating. So we felt it was a strong response for those purposes.
Okay. So this response does show that through modeling is part of that attainment of what they need to know. That makes sense. Karen?
My only complaint was that there were not multiple opportunities, only that one.
Okay. So it could have been enriched by having more than one opportunity described. Yeah. Laura?
Question about it. So could it be attain as one opportunity and demonstrate as a second, or are you okay?
Sure. Yep.
There would be two in this one.
So there would be.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
When I read this standard, it comes to my mind that some of this happens actually in the content area classes. And so we could refer to content area research classes or classes in which they're reading about their content area, learning how to read about their content area and doing presentations, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to be even collaborating with content instructors and understanding, what they're doing when, and especially if the courses are taken either concurrently or in sequence to build on the knowledge that they're attaining, to be able to demonstrate what those expectations are. So yeah, close collaboration between content and methods courses. We know that from the research. That's one of the ways to make this viable. Any areas in which you thought could continue to grow or build, especially in looking at the rubric criteria? I think one area to highlight here too is that third bullet, where you're seeing that the opportunities to attain and demonstrate knowledge of skills and strategies focus more on how reading and writing are used in the discipline, rather than the ability to read, writing, and for reading and writing and the learning the subject matter in a discipline. So what that means is and again, if you attended our webinar, you know that we need those generalizable reading and writing skills, but we also need to support our candidates in understanding how they can attain and demonstrate discipline-specific skills and strategies. So you really do need both. And again, what the shift we're trying to make here, especially in altering the standards language to focus on discipline-specific, is that we're shifting in that direction. So when we're looking for a sampling of responses for this, for these comprehensive questions, that's why we want you to go deep and specific with discipline-specific skills and strategies in at least one endorsement area. Okay? We think that's attainable and realistic, with again the idea that we can learn from that and support the rest of our faculty in these other endorsement areas and shifting in that way as well. I think it is idealistic, but I think that we can make it work by starting somewhere. Any other thoughts?
Could you just point out where this example speaks to what you were saying?
So when we use terms like thinking like a historian, right? So that's how you can tell that we're kind of being engaged within the discipline. And a particular strategy, the soapstone strategy itself, is one that's used for the purpose of understanding the source and the context, right? And that's specific to understanding and thinking like a historian. So that particular strategy is more discipline-specific focused, rather than saying, we're gonna summarize this text, right? Or preview and retell this source. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
My question is regarding the rubric for coaching expectations. The second bullet indicates limited, whereas under needs expectations, the second bullet says multiple. So I can assume multiple means more than one and limited means only one, for example?
Yeah, the language of the actual question says at least two, right? So two, we want it for meets expectation. Multiple in this case would be two. We want to quantify, but really we're kind of looking for that, depth across.
So limited, like if there's one, that would be limited, but two or more would be multiple.
Right. Yes.
And would it also be true if you have two, but one is just being very, very poor
Yeah, I think you're right, Michael, in the way that we kind of think about that is, I know this is again a qualitative review, or sometimes that language is a little bit inclusive, right? But also can be conceived as vague. So we have that word substantial, right? That's another word that we're kind of looking for quality. And so there's no great way to kind of talk about that, but when within reviewer training, we'll try and provide some examples. And I think this goes back to the earlier conversation that we had about evidence and what makes something really strong and robust and give a reviewer a sense of confidence that this is truly integrated, this really is substantial and not just a simple retelling of the rubric language. So if we keep that in mind and use, try and consider that as drafting those responses, that may be helpful.
Something else I'm noticing, the detail describing the text, and to me this is great detail, which is good, and I'm wondering if this kind of detail is important when answering questions. I mean, the idea is to explain the opportunities and what those look like and convey that message. So I'm just wondering about the detail.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's sort of difficult to answer, but I think providing that additional detail about content kind of helps shape, okay, they're learning this for this purpose, and then they're using, that also sort of supports how they're retaining and what they're retaining, so that then it can be used to talk about how they're then going to demonstrate. So I don't think I'd be writing, huge pages of this is all the content, but providing a little bit seems like it makes sense in this case.
prefer to see more depth to one of the substantial than
Okay.
5 different examples without the depth.
Okay. Yeah, because that's really getting at the heart of the
Right.
shift we're trying to
I
make.
feel like I'm in this class, I can see what's happening because there's enough detail. Whereas if they had done 5 paragraphs with 5 little short paragraphs with 5 things, I don't really know that any of those were substantial.
Yeah. No. Yeah, Beth.
I have a question, it's for my colleague here. Is anybody else here in physical education?
Physical ed.
Physical ed? Okay, for the physical ed and health sciences, that's one proposal, right? Okay, so for example, he's answering question 1, and he's giving examples. One example could be from and then other example could be from a health science course.
It could if you offer one. The other example can still be from the same or a different physical ed course. So it can be within the same endorsement area. They are. You're right.
Yes.
Yeah. So you might notice on question 2, there is you have the questions in front of you, I can't remember. Question 2, if you don't have this in front of you, I'll just make this reminder for you. But question 2 actually it has a footnote and it says if you offer more than one endorsement in this proposal area, then you'll want to address at least 2 different endorsement areas with the academic vocabulary section. Now, if you only, for phys ed again, if y'all only offer phys ed, then you can only speak to what you offer, so that wouldn't apply in that case. That's the only question that actually asks for, and 2 examples in different endorsement areas. Good question. Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap up this section here. One thing I want to tell you is that we're going to work to revise that hard copy. And I apologize again that some of those areas were misaligned, but I want to ensure that we don't have any other questions moving forward. So we will fix the errors in the hard copy and send those out post Literacy Network meeting to ensure that what the expectations are in part 1 and part 2 are clear. Question?
On question 3, the rubric says within an earlier clinical experience.
Oh, yep.
Later, can you clarify?
Sure. So all that means is that it could be 2 separate. So when we say clinical experiences, first of all, it can mean early field, student teaching, observations. That's all inclusive word. So it could be, now if your program that you're speaking about for this question only offers student teaching, for example, you could say within an earlier field experience would be like early on in the student teaching, so maybe week 2 or 3, or it could be, and then a later would be like week 15, 16, or they could be 2 separate clinical experiences. Good question. Okay. What time is it? 3:05. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to call on my TDOE colleagues to try and, as you all were wandering around, listening, having good discussions with folks, were there any particular big patterns, questions, aha moments that you feel like would be appropriate to share out to the whole group to sort of help us conclude? Martin?
It's not a big shout out per se.
Yeah.
Other than I heard a lot of different groups talking about.
I heard a lot of different groups talking about how to embed some of these literacy components within the field-based components of preparation. And there was a number of different approaches that I heard, but I heard that in almost every group as I was walking around.
That's great, really thoughtful conversations. Karen, were you going to add to that?
Yeah, well, and I've talked to Martin about this a little bit, which is, it's a little bit of criticism that, for example, the ELA, we have one course in the secondary program that's housed in the College of Education, but most of our courses are in the major, in the arts and sciences, and it's very hard to tell the arts and sciences faculty, you have to do this, and to even collect data on that. I mean, I can't be certain that they're going to do it year after year, nor can I be certain that I can collect any data on it.
Right. It is a challenge, and it's one that I think many EPPs are really struggling with. So I want to acknowledge that this is not the first time we've heard that. I think that we're trying to be really deliberate in thinking about, I don't want all of this to always be about accountability. How can we make, but we know that if there isn't some sort of leverage or accountability piece, then it may not always get done. And so we've been having some conversations internally about what components of each of these literacy reviews will be thought about and integrated within the comprehensive review process. And we know that this is something that we need to consider and that we're working on. And we know that there are elements like something like shifting to disciplinary literacy. That's a focal point of this particular process. So we're going to be thoughtful about integrating those components in a way that makes sense for the comprehensive review. I think in the meantime too, we're all very eager to see post-proposal what all this does look like in implementation, and just to go in the non-accountability space to talk with you all about what's working, how is this impacting your candidates, what are you seeing in terms of clinical experiences and working with the students. And so I think there's still a lot of challenges in that regard, but I think if we can demonstrate there are some really solid examples that other colleges or other faculty members might learn from that and be able to use that and consider that in their own courses, and to really just increase that collaboration. Again, it's an opportunity to collaborate and to continue to persist, even though it can be difficult at times.
If any universities have found the answer to that, let us know.
Anybody have any suggestions for those that they tend to kind of struggle with? Everybody wants to know already.
Here's an example. We just had an external reviewer come to review our secondary programs because there's no communication. And so we wanted someone from an outside entity to be the person who looks from an outside stance and says that type of things, that this is not going well.
And how has that process worked out?
We haven't got the final report yet, so we should get that next in the next couple of weeks.
Well, it's certainly being thoughtful about tackling the issue, right?
I want to make maybe a parallel that's slightly off base, please tell me if it is, but 2-3 years ago, I would say that we had very similar conversations around EPPs and district partners and how districts operated in silos, and that there was a lack of communication and coordination between those two groups. And I think we've come a long way in that regard. So I think that this is, without a doubt, something we've heard many, many times, but I'm hopeful that we can do a lot of what we've done on the work with EPPs and OEAs in figuring out what works, what do good structures and systems look like, find a pocket where it does work, share that back out, get folks talking across EPPs. That was what I was going to share, is something that kind of was an aha for me, is that providing this space for you all is fantastic because you're able to have conversations you don't normally have with folks from all over the state. Obviously, it's a lot of work on our end and yours, quite frankly, as far as travel and time away. But I think we want to continue to find ways to bring folks together to address some of these common challenges that we're seeing.
I do think that the partnership piece is good because EPP's answer to the State Department of Education and LEA's answer to the Department of Education. I think it might help some of us at universities too, if the State Department of Education would get together with TDOE and, have that kind of conversation that, this needs to happen. And so maybe you all could even offer some suggestions about how this can happen.
I'm not going to dwell on this at all, but many of your institutions have structures in place where some of these kinds of shared responsibilities are discussed. I call them teacher ed councils, committees, forums, and over time, these can sometimes erode in terms of who actually has a place on these groups or these structures. So what one approach could be is to see what has transpired in terms of that structure, because most of you have those kinds of structures in place or have had them. Whether or not they're effective is a different matter.
Just as a question that's a little bit out in left field, but thinking broadly and down the road. MTSU, for example, we get a lot of transfer students. So when we have students transfer from different universities or community colleges, we can't always be certain what they're bringing with them and what aspects of literacy standards, because like ETSU, they're not housed just within the College of Ed, they're outside. And so just, there's not necessarily a question, but just how we think about that piece that's out there with transcript students and making sure that they're meeting, if they're coming to us, you know, their junior year, for example, you know, their senior year. That's a piece.
That's a good point. We definitely haven't talked much about transfer students at all, as far as any of them. I think that's a really good point. One initial thought is looking at data and starting to think about the areas where transfer students are doing not as well, and figure out either internally or as a state if we can get to a place where we have some very clear outcomes related to literacy, and we can flag some of those folks, and maybe we can start to think about figuring out what works best.
Any other final thoughts from our participants about questions you still have, how today might have helped support what you all are thinking about in terms of proposal responses? Anything really resonating with you today? We're tired,
I do want to highlight something that Annie mentioned a moment ago about kind of the way our team is thinking about this. We don't want this to be a one and done sort of thing, where we come in and we review your proposals and then you kind of go on and do your business and we never talk about it again. Because we believe this is such a critical area of preparation, we do want to think about what our role in this process looks like following this initial review. So we're having a lot of conversations internally about where can we plug in and look at not just fidelity of implementation, but strong implementation and the impact that that has. And then through the accountability lens, also thinking about the most impactful levers to focus on during our comprehensive review, or the only time we really get to dig deep into your program outside of this sort of work here. So if you have thoughts around that, kind of what we can do and what our role can and potentially the most impactful way that we can be engaged in this work following all of this proposal work, I think we'd love to hear from you. Any thoughts and ideas that you may have?
Yeah, and I think we fully intend on bringing our ideas to this group to negotiate at another literacy network meeting to get your input and feedback on some of these ways to be the most thoughtful about it. Okay, we want to talk just briefly about submitting completed proposals. There are 2 guidance documents. I promise we'll be quick with this. There are 2 guidance documents that are in your red folder. The guidance document for ELA middle and secondary and instructional leader, we combine that information together on a single guidance document. And then we have one for non-ELA, CTE, and pre-K-12 programs. And so what I recommend that you all do, if this is brand new to you, the first step that I would take is to read these guidance documents in detail. What they provide for you are some very explicit naming conventions and attachment guidelines It's sort of the nuts or the logistics behind what we're asking for as you're completing your proposal drafts and before you actually submit. So remember that our deadline for that those first two proposals is January 28th. We use Dropbox for submission of all proposal templates and attachments. And so there is some really explicit guidance listed in there on how you name the particular attachments, how you name the proposal documents, as that you will need to follow before submitting. Just kind of like how we think about a TPA for our candidates, try not to wait the day before to follow all those guidance documents, because if they're turned in wrong, then it could delay your review because we'll have to send it back to you to ensure that you're adhering to the naming conventions and attachment guidelines. So please read those over really carefully. I think we also imagine Dropbox can be tricky sometimes. There's a tutorial that I think we've provided in one of our webinars to help navigate if you're new to Dropbox. We can also help you with some technical support if you have if you're experiencing difficulties on that. What we will do is come beginning of January, as we're getting closer to the deadline for those first two, is we will send out an invitation link to all of our literacy leads. And then those literacy leads can share the link to the Dropbox to any other faculty member or person responsible for drafting and uploading. And then you will have access to that shared folder that we will use for submission, okay? So we anticipate sending out those invitations in early January for those first two groups, and then probably early February for the next group, okay? Please read those over carefully. If you have any questions about that, of course, we'll be there to support that. Any questions about guidance documents or turning these in come January, February? Helen?
So the literacy lead, and I know I've asked you this before,
Mm-hmm.
the literacy lead doesn't have to, because it's massive now, it's not like before.
Right.
So the literacy lead can just share that link to leadership.
Right.
And leadership will upload their own documents into the Dropbox.
That's right. So you might remember a few months ago, we reached out to the original literacy leads who were kind of in charge of the early elementary special education, and we asked for one name per proposal group, just so that we have one contact person. So that's the person that we've identified, and you all then will be in charge of sending it to leadership or to other faculty members. If that person changes, so say you designate somebody for instructional leaders and now that person's different, you can either email me or Lindsay and we can update that information. We're just trying to ensure that we have between 1 to 3 people that we can target for a particular proposal group.
Right, but
to keep
since
that
we're doing
communication.
9,
Yeah.
and I'm the literacy lead,
Yeah.
actually, I'll make sure they get the link.
You're like the coordinator.
I am.
Right. Yes.
Unwillingly.
Well, thank you for doing that.
But I'll make the link. And just to be one positive note is that the conversations that are going on in the College of Ed at the University of Memphis around literacy, I can't even go to the bathroom, and it's exciting conversations about here's what I'm doing to integrate history into, literacy into history. What do you think, Helen? And I'm like, why don't we meet about that? You know, I'm trying to go to the bathroom right now. But the conversations that are happening, and we're a huge college, right? But and I'm not, Annie's not paying me, none of y'all are paying me to say this. The conversations that have been taking place since the beginning, when we did elementary and SPED and early childhood, the conversations that are taking, I've never been so popular in my life. But we're having dynamic, and the conversations, when these professors take their courses and make their courses more literacy friendly and more integrated, who's going to benefit? Those students, those pre-service teachers, those MAT people that are actually in the field, they're going to benefit from this. And so it's a good thing. It's a great thing.
Thank you for sharing that, Helen. We appreciate those kind words, and that's some of the best feedback that we can hear, right? That we know that this is an accountability piece, but to treat it as beyond compliance, but to really be thoughtful about, what do our candidates need? How's this going to impact student learning? And to hear about all that's really exciting for us as well. Any other thoughts or questions? We wanted to outline a few next steps that we are thinking about here. The first of which, this is the last Literacy Network meeting for the calendar year, right? And this is the last Literacy Network meeting that will be focused so deliberately on proposals. And so we're trying to be really thoughtful about what the next calendar year Literacy Network meetings will be focused on. And we really want to get your feedback on that. We want to, zero our lens into what implementation looks like. We mentioned an idea earlier about bringing some thoughts to this group and getting your feedback on the elements of the initial literacy review that may be included within the comprehensive review. But if we go back to sort of those bullets we started the day with, identifying those tensions, thinking about working through those, how are we changing structures and processes to make this really work for our program. So we're really open and would love to get your thoughts on how we want to continue moving this network forward to support all the work that we've put in. So at lunchtime, I think Lindsay had already sent out the link to complete the survey. Really appreciate you just spending a few minutes to do that. We've got the bit.ly address up here now if you feel like doing that as well. There's also something I wanted to mention about, we're calling it collaborative network right here. In July, we posed the idea of collecting folks who are interested in sharing their contact information to network with EPPs across the state outside of the literacy network. So we did include we collected some names and contact information. What we wanted to do is remind all of you that that's an option out there. We'll send out this link as well, or you can complete it right now if you're interested. What you would do is just say, I consent to having my name and email address shared, and I am interested in communicating with EPPs about whatever proposal area that you're interested in. And that way, if you didn't make as many connections today with folks across the state, but are still interested in collaborating outside of state planned events, then you have the opportunity to do so. So we just encourage you to sign up for that if you're interested, and in the next couple weeks we'll send out a list to all those who have self-selected in with contact information so you can continue that good work outside the network. I mentioned the invitations to Dropbox, and we are tentatively planning our next Literacy Network meeting in March. In terms of who we have come to those Literacy Network meetings, as our agendas are taking shape, we will let all of those who our literacy leads let them know well in advance of what a tentative agenda will look like. And then EPPs can make the selection on who they think should attend. We try to keep it around between 1 to 3 people per EPP, just to keep that manageable. But again, as you're completing this survey, be helpful to get your thoughts so we can generate those agenda items early on to let you know so that you can plan accordingly. So again, we're planning for March for our next meeting. Any questions about next steps, things to consider? I'm between you and the door, I know it, I feel it. Well, I will just say thank you again for attending today. We appreciate your hard work and your collaboration and thoughts, and we are available again for technical support as you continue working on these proposals. But I'm feeling really confident. I think our team members can say the same thing, that you all are really moving forward, and we're optimistic to see the outcomes of these proposals. So thank you, safe travels, and thanks again for taking time out of your day to join us.